What you are about to hear represents the single largest military movement Iran has executed in 3 decades. 60,000 Iranian troops have been deployed to the Iraq border. Let that number sink in for a moment. 60,000 soldiers. This is not a routine military exercise. This is not a training drill. This is Iran sending the clearest possible signal to Washington, to Tel Aviv, to every capital watching that the Islamic Republic is prepared for whatever comes next. I am Dr. Sayed Mohammed Marandi, and today we are going to break this story down completely. The what, the why, the how, and the profound implications for every person watching this video right now. Section 1. Confirming the deployment. Let us establish what is confirmed. Iranian military sources and regional intelligence assessments have confirmed the deployment of approximately 60,000 troops to the Iran-Iraq border region. This deployment encompasses ground forces, armored units, artillery battalions, logistical support networks, and specialized units whose presence signals that this is a full-spectrum military positioning, not a symbolic show of force. To understand the scale of what this means, consider the context. The last time Iran mobilized forces at this level toward its western borders was during the final stages of the Iran-Iraq War, a conflict that consumed nearly a decade of Iranian national life, cost the country hundreds of thousands of lives, and shaped the Islamic Republic's strategic thinking in ways that continue to define its military doctrine to this day. For Iran to replicate that scale of military positioning in 2025 tells you everything you need to know about how serious Tehran views the current threat environment. The deployment is spread across multiple provinces along Iran's western frontier. Units have been positioned in a manner consistent with both defensive preparation and offensive capability maintenance. This is not simply Iran digging in to absorb an attack. This is Iran positioning itself to have options, serious, consequential options. Situation continues to deteriorate. Section 2. The context that makes this make sense. Nothing happens in a vacuum. To understand why Iran has taken this extraordinary step, we need to review the chain of events that has brought the region to this precipice. In recent months, American military activity in the broader Middle East region has intensified significantly. Naval deployments have increased. Strike packages have been positioned. Intelligence entschärft entscheidet sein, entschärft ein Sinsur, entschärft and Chapiscax's Bay and reconnaissance activity has expanded. These are not secret developments. They are observable to any serious analyst tracking the region. Simultaneously, Israel has been engaged in a campaign that has killed enormous numbers of people in Gaza and extended its military operations into Lebanon and Syria in ways that continue to reshape the strategic map of the Levant. Iran has watched these developments with deep alarm, not merely because of ideological solidarity with the Palestinian cause, though that is real and should not be dismissed, but because every Israeli military action in the region that goes unchecked expands the operational space for the next Israeli and American military action. There is also the question of what has been happening inside Iraq itself. The political situation in Baghdad has become increasingly volatile. American forces continue to operate in the country, despite the Iraqi parliament's vote demanding their withdrawal. Iranian-aligned political factions and militia groups have been under pressure from multiple directions. And the broader stability of the Iraq-Syria corridor, which is strategically vital to Iran's regional connectivity, has been threatened by various military developments. Against this backdrop, Iran's decision to deploy 60,000 troops to the border is not a reckless escalation. It is a calculated and, from Tehran's perspective, entirely rational strategic response to a security environment that has grown dramatically more threatening. Section 3. What 60,000 troops actually means. Let us talk about raw military capability for a moment because the numbers matter and the composition matters even more than the numbers. 60,000 troops with combined armed support represents a force capable of conducting large-scale, conventional military operations. This is not an insurgency force. This is not a proxy militia. This is the Iranian military, trained, equipped, and organized for peer-level warfare. When Iran deploys this kind of force to a border, it is communicating something very specific, that it has the capacity to physically alter the ground reality in a neighboring country within a very short operational timeline. The presence of armored units in this deployment is particularly significant tanks and armored personnel carriers are not defensive tools in the passive sense. They are offensive maneuver assets. Their presence tells us that Iran is not merely preparing to absorb an attack. It is preparing to respond to an attack in ways that would immediately and dramatically change conditions on the ground. Artillery is the other key component to understand. Modern artillery systems, and Iran has developed considerable indigenous artillery capability, can project lethal force across significant distances. Positioned along the Iraq border, Iranian artillery can cover enormous swaths of territory where American forces operate. This is not a theoretical capability. This is a ready, deployable, precision strike capability. And then there are the logistical elements of this deployment: the fuel convoys, the ammunition stockpiles, the field hospitals, the communications infrastructure. A military force of this size does not move to a border and simply sit there on minimal support. The logistical tale of this deployment tells us that Iran is prepared to sustain this forward positioning for an extended period. This is not a one-week demonstration. This is a long-term strategic commitment. Section 4. The signal to Washington. Washington will try to characterize this deployment as Iranian aggression, as destabilization, as provocative behavior that threatens regional security. That framing inverts the actual causal chain completely, and it needs to be challenged directly. Iran has watched the United States conduct military operations in or near its neighborhood continuously for more than 2 decades. Iran has watched the United States invade and occupy two of its neighbors, Afghanistan and Iraq. Iran has watched American Special Operations Forces, intelligence assets, and proxy forces conduct operations in Syria, Yemen, and across the region. Iran has watched American carrier groups park themselves in the Persian Gulf, which sits on Iran's southern doorstep. And now, when Iran responds to this sustained military pressure by deploying its own forces within its own territory and along its own borders, Washington calls it destabilizing. The hypocrisy would be remarkable if it were not so consistent and predictable. The signal that 60,000 troops sends to Washington is unmistakable. If you strike Iran, or if you greenlight Israel striking Iran, the response will not be limited to missile strikes from Iranian territory. The response will involve a ground component that will fundamentally reshape the strategic situation across the entire region. American forces in Iraq, which number in the thousands, would face a completely transformed threat environment overnight. This is deterrence. This is how deterrence works. You communicate capability and cyber attacks on its nuclear infrastructure, proxy wars on its borders. And through all of this, Iran has demonstrated a consistent pattern. It absorbs pressure, it calculates carefully, and when it decides to act, it acts in ways that are proportionate, strategic, and designed to change the long-term equation rather than simply strike back in anger. The deployment of 60,000 troops to the Iraq border fits this pattern precisely. This is not an emotional reaction. This is a strategic signal delivered with surgical precision in terms of its timing and composition. Iran is telling every actor in the region and every actor watching from outside the region that the days of one-sided military pressure are over. There is something else I want you to understand about what this deployment represents from Iran's perspective. For the Islamic Republic, the integrity of the resistance axis, the network of allied forces stretching from Tehran through Baghdad and Damascus to Beirut and beyond, is not merely a foreign policy preference. It is a core security doctrine. Iran's strategic calculation is that allowing this network to be dismantled piece by piece, either through American military pressure or Israeli military operations, would ultimately leave Iran itself isolated and vulnerable. This deployment is Iran saying, we will not allow that to happen. Section 6. Iraq's impossible position. The country that sits most uncomfortably in the middle of all this is Iraq itself. Iraq shares a long and complex border with Iran. Iraqi society is deeply divided between those who welcome Iranian influence and see it as a natural extension of shared Shia identity and historical connection, and those who resent Iranian involvement and want Iraq to chart its own independent course. The Iraqi government has been trying to walk an increasingly impossible tightrope, maintaining relationships with both Iran and the United States, hosting American forces while negotiating their eventual withdrawal, managing Iranian-aligned militia groups while trying to assert state sovereignty. With 60,000 Iranian troops now positioned on the border, that tightrope just got dramatically harder to walk. From Iran's perspective, having 60,000 troops at the border is also a message to Iraq's political factions. We are here, we are present, and anyone who moves against our interests or our allies in Iraq will face consequences that are now much more immediate and tangible than they were before this deployment. For the Iraqi government in Baghdad, this deployment creates enormous pressure to accelerate the timeline for American troop withdrawal. Having both Iranian troops on the border and American troops inside the country is an untenable situation that increases the risk of Iraq becoming a direct battlefield in a conflict between two external powers. Iraqi leaders who have been moving cautiously on the American withdrawal question may now find that the timetable is being decided for them. Section 7, Regional Reactions. The deployment has triggered reactions across the region. Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are watching with deep concern. Despite recent diplomatic rapprochements between Saudi Arabia and Iran, engineered partly through Chinese mediation, the underlying strategic competition has not disappeared. A large Iranian military mobilization on its western border reminds Gulf leaderships that Iran's military power is real, close, and consequential. Turkey, which has its own complex relationships with both Iran and the Kurdish groups that straddle the borders of Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, is watching the situation carefully. Turkish military forces also operate inside Iraqi territory, and any significant escalation along the Iran-Iraq border would have immediate implications for Turkish strategic calculations. Israel is watching most carefully of all. Israeli military planning for any potential strike against Iranian nuclear or military infrastructure has always had to account for Iranian retaliatory capability. The forward deployment of 60,000 troops to the Iraq border changes the calculus for any such strike. It means that a retaliatory Iranian response would not need to cross significant distances. Forces are already positioned. They can be in motion with an ekramashro. The nuclear dimension. We cannot discuss Iran's military posture without acknowledging the nuclear dimension, even if only briefly. Iran's nuclear program has been a persistent source of tension with the West and with Israel for over 2 decades. The status of that program, the question of enrichment levels, of breakout timelines, of weaponization research, remains deeply contested between Iran and the IAEA and between Iran and Western governments. What the deployment of 60,000 troops tells us is that Iran has concluded, at least provisionally, that it needs a conventional military deterrent that is credible and immediate, regardless of where the nuclear question ultimately lands. Iran is not waiting for nuclear deterrence. It is building conventional deterrence now in real time through exactly this kind of massive military positioning. This is actually a message of de-escalation in a strange way. Iran is saying, we do not need nuclear weapons to deter you. We have 60,000 troops, we have missiles, we have allies across the region. We can make any military adventure against Iran so costly that the rational calculation should be to avoid it. Whether Washington and Tel Aviv accept that deterrence logic or choose to challenge it is the question that will define the next phase of regional history. Section 9. What happens next? The deployment is in place. The troops are at the border. What happens next depends on decisions that will be made in the coming days and weeks in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Tehran. The optimistic scenario is that this deployment serves its deterrent purpose, that Washington and Israel look at 60,000 Iranian troops on the Iraq border, calculate the cost of a confrontation, and decide that diplomacy is the more rational path. In this scenario, The deployment becomes part of a negotiated de escalation, perhaps involving renewed discussions about the nuclear file, about regional security arrangements, about the framework for American military presence in Iraq. The pessimistic scenario, and it must be stated honestly, is that one side or another miscalculates, that a strike happens, that a retaliatory action triggers a counter response, and that the escalation ladder is climbed before anyone has fully grasped the consequences of the next step. In this scenario, 60,000 troops at the border is not a deterrent. It is the opening position in a war. The history of this region is full of moments where miscalculation led to catastrophe. The Iran-Iraq War began partly through miscalculation. The American invasion of Iraq was the product of catastrophic miscalculation. The assumption that the Taliban would collapse without American support was a miscalculation. The region has paid enormous prices for the errors of powerful actors who were certain of their analysis and wrong about the consequences. Closing, 60,000 troops, the largest military mobilization Iran has undertaken in 30 years, deployed to the Iraq border right now. This is the reality of where the region stands today. This is what the world looks like when years of accumulated pressure, unresolved conflicts, and competing interests reach a breaking point of strategic positioning. I want to be clear. Iran is not looking for a war. No rational government with an understanding of the human cost of modern warfare wants a conflict. But Iran is also not going to allow itself to be intimidated, coerced, or destroyed through inaction. The deployment of these forces is the clearest possible statement that Iran has options, that Iran has capability, and that anyone who is calculating the cost of military action against Iran or against Iran's core interests needs to update their estimate significantly. This is Dr. Marandi. Please share this analysis with everyone you know. What is happening in this region will affect not just the people who live here, but the entire global order. Understanding it, really understanding it, not through the filtered and distorted lens of Western media, is the first step toward demanding accountability from the governments whose decisions are driving us toward catastrophe. Subscribe, stay informed. The story is not over, it is just beginning.